I never thought I'd be the guy making one of these videos, but when someone violates your property and destroys something irreplaceable, you have to speak up. The morning I found chainsaws ripping through my 200-year-old maple trees still haunts me. The sound of wood cracking, the smell of fresh sawdust, and the cold smirk on Patricia Whitman's face as she stood there with her clipboard, checking off another violation handled. But what she didn't know was that those trees weren't just part of my property. They were protected by state law, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Hey everyone, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when the nightmare began. I was working from home that day, thankfully. My home office window faces the front yard where those majestic maples stood, their branches stretching toward the sky, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. They were the reason I bought this house in Maple Creek Estates 4 years ago. The irony of the community name isn't lost on me now. The rumble of engines pulled my attention from my laptop. 3 trucks with the Western Hills Landscaping logo parked along my curb. Men in neon vests piled out, unloading chainsaws and ropes. I frowned, confused. I hadn't scheduled any tree work. Then I spotted her. Patricia Whitman, HOA president, standing at the edge of my property, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, checklist in hand. Her ash-blonde bob didn't move an inch in the wind. Shellacked to perfection, just like every aspect of the community she ruled with an iron fist. I bolted outside, still in my house slippers, nearly tripping on the front steps. "What's going on here?" I called out, my voice sharper than intended. One of the workers, already positioning a ladder against my oldest maple, paused. Patricia stepped forward, her smile tight and rehearsed. "Good morning, Mr. Foster. We're implementing the board's decision regarding your non-compliant landscaping. These trees exceed the height restriction in Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our community guidelines. We've sent 3 notices." My blood ran cold. "I never received any notices, and these trees were here long before your guidelines existed. They're over 200 years old." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "The guidelines apply to all vegetation on Maple Creek properties, regardless of age." The board voted unanimously. The chainsaw roared to life behind her, and I felt something snap inside me. I rushed forward, placing myself between the worker and my tree. "Stop! These trees are protected!" I shouted over the engine's noise. The worker looked uncertainly at Patricia, who gave a curt nod. "Continue, please. Mr. Foster is just upset. He'll calm down." That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. Patricia Whitman is authorizing the destruction of heritage trees that are protected under state law. I have documentation that these maples are registered with the State Historical Preservation Society. Patricia's expression darkened. "Turn that off. You're making a scene." "I'm documenting a crime," I countered, keeping the camera steady. "These trees were registered last year after my arborist confirmed their age. Cutting them down without proper permits is illegal. Not just against HOA rules, but actual law." Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her clipboard. "We don't need your permission, Mr. Foster. When you purchased this property, you agreed to abide by the HOA covenants. Section 27 gives the board authority to remedy violations." I stood my ground, heart hammering in my chest. "Call them off now, or I call the police and the Environmental Protection Office. Your choice." For a moment, I thought she might back down. Then she laughed, a short, dismissive sound that sent chills down my spine. "Go ahead. The police will tell you this is a civil matter. By the time your environmental office even answers the phone, these trees will be gone." She turned to the crew. "Continue, please." The worker revved the chainsaw again, moving toward the first branch. I did the only thing I could think of. I planted myself directly in the cutting path. "If you cut this tree, you'll have to cut through me first," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Patricia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Really, Daniel? This theatrics is beneath you. You're holding up progress for the entire community. How exactly are my trees impeding community progress?" I demanded. "They drop leaves and sap on the sidewalk. Mrs. Peterson's grandson slipped last fall. The roots are damaging the pavement. They block the uniform street view. Do I need to continue?" As we argued, I noticed movement across the street. My neighbor, Harold Jenkins, an 80-year-old retired judge who'd lived in the neighborhood long before it became Maple Creek Estates, was watching from his porch. He disappeared inside his house, only to emerge moments later with what looked like a folder under his arm. He crossed the street with surprising speed for his age. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being heard in courtrooms. Patricia's smile returned instantly. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Mr. Jenkins, just handling a violation." Harold looked up at the maples, then at me, then at the landscaping crew. "Those are heritage trees. I remember when this land was still the old Morgan farm. These trees were ancient even then, when I was a boy." Patricia's smile tightened. "With all due respect, Mr. Jenkins, the HOA guidelines don't supersede state law." Harold finished for her. He opened the folder he was carrying. "I've served as a conservation committee member for 40 years. These particular trees were documented in the county's historical survey in 1976. He handed me a photocopy of what looked like an official document. There in black and white was a map of the original property with these very trees marked and dated as Est 1820, 1830. Patricia looked increasingly uncomfortable. "That's very interesting, but the board has made its decision." I held up the document, and I've made mine. I'm calling Jason Torres at the Environmental Protection Office right now. He issued the protection certificate for these trees last year. I dialed the number, putting it on speaker as it rang. Patricia's face flushed red. "This is absurd," she hissed. "You can't just—" "Environmental Protection Office, Torres speaking," came the voice from my phone. "Jason, it's Dan Foster from 247 Oakwood Drive in Maple Creek. The HOA is attempting to cut down my registered heritage maples right now. They have chainsaws on site." There was a pause. "The trees we certified last October, those are protected under State Code 47(3). "That's what I've been trying to explain," I said, looking directly at Patricia. "Is the HOA representative there?" Jason asked. "Yes, Patricia Whitman, HOA president." "Put her on, please." Reluctantly, Patricia stepped closer to the phone. "This is Patricia Whitman. Ms. Whitman, I'm informing you that those trees are protected under state environmental law. Damaging them carries penalties up to $50,000 per tree, plus restoration costs. I suggest you halt all activities immediately while I dispatch an officer to the site." Patricia's face went from red to white. She raised a hand to signal the crew to stop. The chainsaw fell silent. "There must be some misunderstanding," she began. "Our guidelines clearly state—" "Your guidelines don't override state law," Jason interrupted. "Our officer will be there in approximately 20 minutes. I suggest everyone remain on site until then." The call ended, and an uncomfortable silence fell over my front yard. The landscaping crew looked nervously at each other. One of them muttered something about not getting paid enough for this and began packing away his equipment. Patricia straightened her blazer, composure cracking just slightly. "We'll pause until this misunderstanding is cleared up, but the board's decision stands." Harold Jenkins chuckled beside me. "Patricia, you might want to consult with the HOA's lawyer before digging yourself any deeper. I watched the Stevensons over on Elm try something similar with protected wetlands. Back in '08, cost the HOA nearly $250,000 in legal fees and penalties. The mention of costs made Patricia flinch visibly. If there was one thing she cared about more than rules, it was the HOA budget, which she reminded everyone came from their dues. "We'll review the situation," she said stiffly, then turned to the crew. "Pack up for now." As the workers loaded their equipment, cars began slowing as they passed. Word travels fast in suburban neighborhoods, and nothing draws attention like controversy. Patricia noticed too, her eyes darting to each vehicle, recognition flashing across her face as she spotted fellow HOA members watching the scene unfold. "This isn't over, Mr. Foster," she said quietly, just for me to hear. "The board won't appreciate you making trouble." I smiled, feeling confident for the first time since this began. "I'm not making trouble, Patricia. I'm protecting what's legally mine. There's a difference." She walked away, phone already pressed to her ear, no doubt calling an emergency board meeting. The landscaping trucks pulled away one by one, leaving my trees intact for now. Harold patted my shoulder. "They won't stop here, son. I've watched that woman steamroll half the neighborhood with her interpretations of those guidelines. Once she sets her sights on something, she's like a dog with a bone." I nodded, looking up at my maples, their leaves shimmering in the midday sun. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know, but some things are worth fighting for. I've got copies of the original land surveys from when this development was built," Harold offered, "and photos of these trees going back decades might come in handy." "Thanks, Harold. I have a feeling I'll need all the help I can get." I wasn't wrong. By that evening, a certified letter had been slipped under my door. A formal notice of violation, citing not just the trees, but suddenly a dozen other minor infractions. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My garden hose wasn't properly stored. The bird bath in my backyard wasn't an approved ornament. Patricia was retaliating, throwing the rulebook at me, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. I hadn't mentioned to her that I worked in environmental law before switching to tech 3 years ago. I still had contacts, knowledge, and resources that would prove valuable in the coming battle. The next morning, I woke to the distinctive sound of a car door slamming. Through my bedroom window, I could see a black SUV with the Environmental Protection Office logo parked in my driveway. Jason Torres had arrived, clipboard in hand, already examining the trees. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to meet him, bringing the file of documentation I'd compiled the previous night. "Morning, Dan," Jason greeted me. "I see the trees are still standing. That's good." "For now," I replied. "But the HOA isn't backing down." Jason ran his hand along the bark of the nearest maple, his expression reverent. 200 years. They've survived countless storms, disease, urban development. It would be criminal to lose them to an HOA squabble. He took measurements, photographs, and samples, documenting everything with methodical precision. "I'm updating the registry entry with today's assessment. This will strengthen the protection status." As Jason worked, I noticed several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching curiously. Some looked supportive, others uncomfortable. Among them was Linda Morris, one of the HOA board members, pretending to check her mail while obviously monitoring the situation. "Your HOA president called our office supervisor yesterday," Jason mentioned casually as he packed up his equipment. "Tried to argue that our certification was granted without proper jurisdiction, since this is private property under HOA governance." I wasn't surprised. And our supervisor reminded her that state environmental protections supersede private governance structures. But she's persistent, I'll give her that. Jason handed me an official-looking document. "This is a cease and desist order. It prohibits any attempt to remove or damage these trees without state approval, posted visibly on each tree." I took the papers, relief washing over me. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jason warned. This protects the trees legally, but determined HOAs can find creative workarounds. They might not be able to cut them down, but they could make your life difficult in other ways. He wasn't exaggerating. That afternoon, as I was attaching the protection notices to my trees, a group of HOA board members convened on Linda Morris's front porch across the street. They weren't even trying to be subtle, pointing and discussing while glaring in my direction. By evening, emails had been sent to every homeowner in Maple Creek Estates about an urgent community safety concern regarding dangerous trees on Oakwood Drive. The message heavily implied that I was selfishly endangering children and property by insisting on keeping unstable, oversized trees that could fall during the next storm. It was a clever angle, recasting environmental protection as public endangerment. Patricia was rallying the community against me, turning neighbors into adversaries. The unofficial HOA grapevine hummed with exaggerated stories about near misses from falling branches that had never actually fallen. The pressure built quickly. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox. Think about the safety of our children and don't be selfish. Someone created a group chat titled Maple Creek Safety Concerns that excluded me but apparently included nearly everyone else. I tried speaking with neighbors directly, explaining the historical significance of the trees, showing the arborist's report confirming their health and stability. Some listened. Most had already chosen sides. 3 days after the initial confrontation, I returned home from work to find a formal notice taped to my door. The HOA was calling a special community meeting to discuss the tree situation and associated safety concerns. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community clubhouse. This was Patricia's power play, a public forum where she could control the narrative, pressure me in front of my neighbors, perhaps even force a community vote that, while not legally binding on protected trees, would isolate me socially within Maple Creek. I needed to prepare. The morning of the meeting, I contacted Dr. Amanda Collins, the arborist who had originally certified the trees. She agreed to attend as an expert witness. Michael Rodriguez, an attorney friend specializing in property disputes, offered to accompany me for legal support. Harold Jenkins promised to bring his historical documentation and persuade other longtime residents to speak about the tree's significance to the area. But Patricia had been busy too. When I arrived at the clubhouse that evening, the parking lot was full, a much larger turnout than the typical HOA meetings that usually drew only the most dedicated rule enforcers. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Chairs had been arranged, theater style, facing a table where Patricia and the other board members sat like judges at a tribunal. A projector displayed dramatic photos of storm damage from fallen trees, though notably none from our neighborhood or involving any trees resembling mine. Handouts on everyone's chairs detailed the danger signs of unstable trees, with dubious statistics about property damage and personal injury. Patricia had stacked the deck, creating an environment of fear before the meeting even began. As I made my way to an empty seat, conversations hushed. Eyes followed me, some sympathetic, most wary, or outright hostile. Patricia watched from her elevated position, a tight smile on her lips. She thought she had won before we'd even started. But she didn't know what I had discovered that afternoon. The meeting began with Patricia's opening statement, a masterclass in manipulative rhetoric. She expressed deep concern for community safety, praised the unified standards that kept property values high, and lamented how one individual's refusal to comply threatened everything they had built together. Next came a slideshow of tree disasters. Massive oaks crushing homes, pines splintering during storms, maples toppling onto cars. With each image, the tension in the room grew. Parents pulled children closer. Elderly residents shook their heads. In concern, "These are the risks we face," Patricia concluded solemnly. "Is maintaining 3 oversized trees worth endangering the lives of your neighbors? Your children?" She gestured to me, and suddenly every eye in the room turned my way. "Mr. Foster has been informed multiple times that his trees violate our height restrictions. He has received formal notices, yet he refuses to comply, hiding behind a technicality, a state certification he applied for specifically to circumvent our guidelines." The murmurs in the room grew louder, disapproving. Patricia had successfully painted me as the villain, a selfish rule breaker endangering the community. "Now," she continued, "I open the floor for community input on this urgent matter." Hands shot up around the room. Patricia selectively called on those she knew would support her position. One by one, neighbors I had waved to, chatted with at community events, stood to express their concerns about my trees. My grandchildren play near those trees. During the last windstorm, I heard creaking sounds. Property values will suffer if accidents happen. The pile-on continued for 15 excruciating minutes. Patricia managed the speakers masterfully, cutting off anyone who veered from her narrative, encouraging those who reinforced it. When Dr. Collins attempted to interject with scientific facts about tree stability assessment, Patricia smoothly interrupted. "We'll have time for technical opinions later. Right now, we're hearing from concerned residents." Finally, Patricia turned to me with false graciousness. "Mr. Foster, would you like to address your neighbor's concerns?" I stood, feeling the weight of hostile stares, but instead of immediately defending myself, I walked to the front of the room. "Before I respond, I'd like to share something I discovered today that everyone here should know about." I connected my laptop to the projector, replacing Patricia's dramatic fallen tree images with a spreadsheet. This is the HOA's financial record from the past 3 years, which as homeowners, we're all entitled to review. Patricia's smile vanished. She moved as if to stop me, but my attorney friend Michael stood. "As a reminder, HOA bylaws section. 5 guarantees members the right to address community concerns with relevant information during official meetings." Patricia froze, then slowly sat back down. I highlighted specific rows on the spreadsheet. 3 months ago, the board approved a $75,000 expenditure for community beautification. No details were provided in the minutes. I found it odd, so I did some digging. The room had gone completely silent. It turns out Patricia and the board have already signed a contract with Horizon Developers for a community entrance redesign. The plans, which none of us have seen, involve removing all non-standard vegetation within 50 feet of Oakwood and Maple intersection, exactly where my house and these 200-year-old trees are located. Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Patricia's face had turned the color of paper. The contract includes a $30,000 bonus if construction can begin by July 1st, just 2 weeks from now, which explains the sudden urgency to remove trees that have been here for 2 centuries. I clicked to the next slide, a beautiful architectural rendering of a grand community entrance with stone pillars, fountains, and not a historic tree in sight. This isn't about safety, it's about this. The room erupted. Homeowners who moments ago had been condemning my trees were now shouting questions at Patricia. Why hadn't they been consulted? Where was the money coming from? Would their HOA fees increase? Patricia tried desperately to regain control, banging her gavel, calling for order. But the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. In the chaos, I stepped back and let the community's anger find its true target. The trees were no longer the issue. The secretive decision-making and misuse of HOA funds had taken center stage. I caught Harold Jenkins's eye across the room. The old judge gave me a subtle nod of approval. The trees would survive another day, and Patricia's reign over Maple Creek Estates might not. The community meeting descended into chaos. Patricia frantically tried to restore order, banging her gavel like a judge at a runaway trial, but the damage was done. The revelation of the secret development contract had completely shifted the focus. Several homeowners rushed forward, demanding to see the full financial records. Others formed heated discussion groups, voices rising as they debated whether this constituted financial misconduct. I stepped back, letting the scene unfold. Dr. Collins, the arborist, leaned toward me. "Quite the chess move," she murmured. "Exposing their real motivations changes everything." My attorney friend Michael nodded in agreement. "They can't claim. It's about safety when there's a paper trail proving otherwise." Eventually, Richard Green, the HOA treasurer, managed to quiet the crowd. His face flushed with embarrassment. He stammered through an explanation about preliminary explorations and potential beautification concepts that hadn't been finalized for community review. It was damage control, poorly executed. Patricia, however, wasn't backing down. Once she regained control of the microphone, her voice had taken on a steel edge. "While Mr. Foster's theatrical presentation is certainly dramatic, it doesn't change the fundamental issue. Those trees violate our guidelines. The beautification project is a separate matter that has been mischaracterized." She was good, pivoting quickly, refusing to concede. But the room had already turned. Even those who had spoken against my trees earlier were now eyeing the board with suspicion. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me with newfound support. Some apologized for believing the safety concerns. Others praised my research. The tide had turned, at least temporarily. Patricia cornered me as I was leaving. "This isn't over," she hissed, her perfect composure finally cracking. "You've made a powerful enemy, Daniel." "I didn't start this." "A fight," I replied calmly. "You brought chainsaws to my trees." The next morning, I found my front yard covered in bright orange construction flags. A formal notice was taped to my door, claiming the HOA needed to inspect the root systems of my trees for infrastructure damage assessment. It was a transparent attempt to find another angle of attack. I called Jason at the environmental office immediately. Within hours, he arrived with a cease and desist order for any ground disruption near the heritage trees. The flags disappeared that afternoon. Then came the fines. Suddenly, I was being penalized for everything from improper garbage can storage to unauthorized bird feeding. Each day brought a new violation notice, each more absurd than the last. But Patricia had overplayed her hand. Her vendetta was now obvious to everyone. Neighbors who had ignored me before now stopped to chat, sharing their own HOA horror stories. What started as my personal fight was evolving into something larger, a community questioning the unchecked power of their homeowners association. Harold Jenkins proved invaluable, connecting me with other residents who had suffered similar treatment. Together, we formed an informal coalition, researching HOA bylaws and state regulations. We discovered that several board actions over the past year, including Patricia's emergency powers to authorize tree removal, violated their own governance rules. The final blow came unexpectedly. Rebecca Chen, a local reporter who lived 3 streets over, had attended the community meeting. Intrigued by the drama, she began investigating the Horizon Developers contract. Her research revealed that Patricia's brother-in-law was a silent partner in the development company, a clear conflict of interest she had never disclosed. The story broke on a Monday. By Wednesday, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called. Patricia didn't attend. The acting chair, looking uncomfortable and sleep-deprived, announced her immediate resignation for personal reasons. The coalition we had formed presented a motion for a complete board audit. and revised tree policies that would respect historical and environmental designations. It passed unanimously. As I walked home that evening, I stopped beneath my maples, looking up at their vast canopy against the sunset sky. These trees had witnessed centuries of human drama, wars, depressions, technological revolutions. They had survived countless storms and challenges, and now they had survived Patricia Whitman. 2 weeks later, while raking the first summer leaves, I noticed a car slow down near my driveway. Patricia sat behind the wheel, staring at my trees with an unreadable expression. For a moment our eyes met. I expected anger, perhaps a threat. Instead, she simply nodded once, an acknowledgement, not an apology, before driving away. I never saw her in the neighborhood again. The new HOA board, elected the following month, approached their role with refreshing humility. Their first official act was to commission a neighborhood heritage survey, identifying and protecting significant natural and architectural features throughout Maple Creek. My trees became the centerpiece of a small gathering area at the edge of my property, a place where neighbors now stop to rest in the shade, where children collect fallen leaves in autumn, where the community has rediscovered something valuable about itself. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't just about the thing we're fighting for, but about uncovering what others are really fighting against. Patricia never cared about my trees. She cared about power, control, and profit. In exposing her true motivations, we didn't just save 3 ancient maples, we restored a community's voice. I often think about what would have happened if I hadn't been home that Tuesday morning, if I hadn't heard those chainsaws, if I hadn't stood my ground. Some things, once lost, can never be replaced. 200 years of growth, of history, of quiet witness to the world changing around them. Those trees will outlive me, just as they outlived Patricia's reign. And perhaps that's the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.